Hello, my name is Devin Barrington-Ward, but if you see me on the street, you can call me the prison abolitionist guy, and here is an outpour of my story. Coming out story is layered. I've come out in stages. I think many of us can identify with that, particularly as a queer person whose attraction to people is fluid. I have come out, the first time I came out, I guess I always came out as being bisexual or pansexual. The first time that I came out, I was in high school. And, my ex-girlfriend at the time was like, you should really explore this other side of you, because she was definitely exploring the other side of her. And, but there was also, and I still value that to this day, that she allowed me to go out and do that. And I also remember the conversation I had with my mom, which is a very different conversation now, but when I was 16, 17, when she found out that I was bisexual, my family's Caribbean, and so she was like, you ain't doing that, you have to choose, you ain't doing that, bisexual thing, you gotta be one or the other. And I remember feeling really conflicted in that, and then also, interestingly enough, meeting that same type of attitude in the LGBTQ community, meeting gay and lesbian people who were confused by my attraction to both sexes. And so for a while, particularly because my work was very public, or it's still very public, but at the time, it was easier in some spaces just to identify as a gay man. And so I didn't necessarily talk about my experiences and my attractions to other people that were not men. And so, that was an interesting piece in my life. And so I say my coming out story is something I've come out over stages, or I have peeled back the layers of myself over the years. So my mom and my family are very much supportive. My grandmother and my mom, they understand who I am. They don't try and get involved in all of the nuances and the complications around my sexuality and the people that I'm engaged with, but they are supportive in the sense of they love me. And they see my power beyond my sexuality, and they see the contributions that I make to the community and to our family beyond my sexual preferences. And so I'm very blessed to have that experience with them and feel really grateful that they're able to support me in that way. Yeah, I've always been I've always had the gift of gab, as my grandmother and my mom would say. And I've always been outspoken, sharing my opinion. My mom would say, I'm 4 going on 40. And there was definitely some truth in that, because as my family recounts some of the stories that they remember of me stepping up and speaking my mind, I'm confronted with the fact that I've always been this person since I was born in 1990. And so, yeah, that has always been me. And I think that story, I remember my mom telling me about being in the grocery store, and this man who I think was an attorney or something like that, asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I was like 3 or 4. And he was like, do you want to be a football player? Which, he was a white man, and so there was definitely some racist undertones to that. But at the time, I'm 3 or 4, so I didn't necessarily know that. I was just standing in my power. And I replied to him, and I was like, no, I think I want to own the team. And he gave me $100. And so from a very early age, I've always spoken my mind. I've always said what I've had to say. I've always shared my opinion. I've always had very bold opinions that are out of the box, opinions that don't always match up with how the status quo of where people feel that they are. But the reason I call my company the Black Futurist Group is because in some ways I've always been a futurist. I've always been thinking about what's next. And so some of my thoughts and my perspectives have always been outside of the box and forward thinking. I think about how, just a few years ago, to talk about closing 10 years ago, talking about closing a correctional facility and defunding it by $30 million would be unheard of. It would be not within our scope of our imagination. But because of myself and people like me who I have the privilege of organizing and fighting for Black people and liberation for on a daily basis, we've always had that vision, even when we weren't naming it as that we knew that there was something better than what we have today. And so that has been something in my spirit since I was a child, playing with Hot Wheels and Legos and making imaginary cities. And cities where people don't have to, pay rent and people don't have to pay taxes and all those type of things. But that's the child's imagination. And in some ways, as a Pisces, I'm always imaginative. I'm always thinking about the future. I'm never necessarily grounded in the constructs of what people think is possible today. What is possible today and what is possible tomorrow is a future where we are no longer colluding with our own oppression, where we're not negotiating how we are supposed to be free and liberated. And what that means in practice is it means it's a future that we don't always look to cages and jail cells as the way to solve the issues in our society. It's a future where we recognize the need for universal health care. It's a future where we recognize that housing is a right. It's a future where we recognize that healthcare is a right. It's a future where we can end the HIV epidemic. And it's a future where we can build wealth for all communities, but particularly the communities that have been harmed the most, that have been disenfranchised the most, and that we can build wealth in those communities in a way that doesn't take advantage of someone else and in a way that doesn't harm other communities. That our liberation and our ability to live well doesn't have to come at the expense of another human being. I am willing to be uncomfortable to make change because change oftentimes is birthed out of uncomfortable situations. When we are comfortable, we remain complacent, and we oftentimes stay in the same place, the same dying, dead, dangerous status quo of a place. And a lot of times people like to call folks revolutionary and radical, but what is really radical is the status quo. The status quo is killing people. The status quo is radical because we have a president that is overseeing a country right now where there's a global pandemic that is the epicenter here, where Black and brown people are most impacted by it, where people are living on the street, where law enforcement indiscriminately takes lives for people who are in the Black and brown community, where trans people are not safe in their own communities. And so what is radical is the status quo. But I believe if we're defining being a revolutionary and being uncomfortable, then yeah, I'm comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I actually don't trust people who are not willing to be uncomfortable for the collective good of what is right and what is just in the world. And I also don't trust people who are liked by everybody. Everybody doesn't need to like me. White supremacists don't like me. If you're a racist, don't like me. If you think that people who are undocumented deserve to have hysterectomies when no one is telling them and deserve to be locked into cages and to be ripped away from their children, don't like me. If you think that it's okay to police people's sexuality, don't like me. If you think that it's okay to jail Black and brown people indiscriminately for minor violations, don't like me. So yeah, I'm comfortable with not being liked by everybody. That's okay, because everybody ain't gonna make it to the future. But I know the people who will make it to the future are those that see the value and put heart in the understanding that we can end human suffering and that we have an obligation to do so. The nonprofit industrial complex is really the theory that there are those who are working in nonprofit and build nonprofit organizations to really sustain human suffering rather than ending it. And so what does that mean? That means that when we don't empower communities who are directly impacted by housing laws, but we build organizations that really just continue to drug the issue further and further and not actually work to end it, that means that there are organizations that are building themselves unto themselves, right? Building themselves and creating themselves to sustain an issue, but not to end an issue. And we see a lot of organizations that really sustain human suffering or, keep it really flat. by not offering radical proposals, by not offering a new path forward, by not offering something that's different from the status quo. And it gets in the way of communities that actually want to build power. When the power of the people who are oppressed, people who are living with HIV, trans people, people who are undocumented, when their power sits within a nonprofit organization and it is not distributed evenly amongst the people, then the power is not where it needs to be. And it sits within an institution whose goal is to raise money, whose goal is to pay people, whose goals is to sustain an issue and oftentimes not work themselves out of a job. I built the Black Futurist group through my evolution of work in government and in the nonprofit industrial complex, and seeing that I didn't want to be like these institutions, I didn't want to be like some of the elected officials that I worked for, and that I wanted to do something new and out of the box. So a lot of times people ask me what's next, what's the next project, and we're not done because liberation for Black people has not been achieved. And so we will continue to demand that we defund police and reimagine public safety and put public safety back in the hands of community. So many communities live in places where the police are a foreign occupation force because they don't live in the communities that they are policing. They don't value the communities that they are policing. They see the people that they are policing as enemies. And so because of that, we have to drastically restructure and dismantle the system of policing in this country, a system of policing that's grounded in old slave codes. The first police department in this country, the Charleston Watch, their responsibility was to track down fugitive slaves. Later, we saw that police were used to suppress labor movements and the unionization of workers in Pennsylvania. And so we see that the police oftentimes are used to suppress the freedom and liberation of people who are already oppressed by white supremacy and racism in this country and abroad. And so my work is continuing to work in collaboration and partnership and co-lead the Atlanta chapter of the Movement for Black Lives. My work has continued to build the Black Futurist group. Right now, we have a very specific demand to remove $73 million out of the $218 million police department budget here in the city of Atlanta. And we know that it's something that's possible because our bill that initially was introduced only lost by one vote. One person on council did not have the courage to stand up for Rayshard Brooks, a Black man that was gunned down in a Wendy's parking lot, a peaceful Black man that was talking to police officers for more than 20 minutes who offered, I can walk home, but nobody offered to give him a ride home. Someone who no one offered to give him a Lyft or an Uber home and was gunned down. A father, a life that was not needed to have been taken. But that is the narrative oftentimes in this city for Black people. Alexia Christian, a Black trans woman, killed by the Atlanta Police Department. DeAndre Phillips, a Black man, killed by the Atlanta Police Department because they smelled marijuana in his car. Oscar Kane, a Black organizer and activist in the city, killed by the Atlanta Police Department. So we continue to see this ledger of death. And so until that ledger stops, I have to continue the work that I do, and I have to continue to support the work of my comrades who are fighting for freedom and liberation in our lifetime. So why I decided to run for office was because I was not pleased with the level of representation that I was getting from my current state senator, and I knew that I had a body of work that overshined hers, and that the people in the community that I spoke to daily were upset that they did not see their state senator in over 6 years, were upset that they didn't have regular engagement with this person that is responsible for conveying their concerns at the Gold Dome downtown at the Georgia General Assembly. Upset that we did not have a state senator that was a stronger voice against the lawlessness of our current governor, Brian Kemp. And so I decided, as someone who has a history of taking on this governor from the start, before he was even sworn into office, this governor arrested me and 15 other protesters in 2018 when we demanded that every vote be counted, and we called out the fact that it was illegal for him to oversee his own election and call himself the victor over his own election because he was the Secretary of State, which is responsible for elections in Georgia. So I have a history and a track record of taking on this governor, but I also had a track record of working with the governor. I worked with State Representative Park Cannon to pass legislation that would allow the Department of Health to expand PrEP access in the state of Georgia. And I did that bipartisanly. So I have a long work history and a legislative body of work that I felt like was what was needed for the next state senator from my district. And so I ran. The week after I went and made it official at the state capitol, the COVID-19 pandemic really started to take shape. And I lost 2.5 months of campaigning to the pandemic. And so as a first-time candidate, that's really hard to overcome. But when the world did, or Georgia opened back up, and we probably opened back up prematurely, but when we opened back up and delayed our election, I immediately got and hit the streets. And it's why I believe we were able to come in third place. If I could go back in time and speak to my previous self, I would look myself in the face, I will point at myself and say, don't be scared. Don't let these people punk you. Don't let these people tell you that it's not possible. Don't let people put limits around your imagination. That's what I would go back and tell myself. And a lot of my friends, I would also not just talk to myself, but I would talk to like my day one friends and be like, don't be scared. Go do the thing. Start the restaurant. Write the book. Date the person. Propose. Whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing, the future that you're supposed to build for yourself. No fear. No fear is what I would go back and tell my previous self. I'm Devin Barrington-Ward, the freedom fighter, the community organizer, the advocate, the Black queer man, the former candidate for Georgia State Senate, a candidate in the future for another office to be determined. And this is my story, and I'm sticking to it, y'all. I'm out. It's over. Bye.